To welcome everyone, both here in this space and online. We have a good cast who are at a distance or just not able to attend in the space, but are here live with us. Let's begin with prayer in this space. And especially for a session like this, call to mind not just those who are here with us now, but those who are here in memory and in history from the earliest days of this place. Going back even further to remember those who preceded us by centuries, the ground in which we stand, that others have cultivated and known and loved. For our forebears here, those who are buried right around this place, for their courage and resilience, and also for their places in which they were blind to realities that we now see more clearly. For ourselves and the ways we are seeing more clearly and the ways in which we are still blind to our actions, their consequences. All this we bring to mind in this present moment, invited here by the Spirit, giving thanks for the healing and wholeness and invitation to do and to be in this moment that the Spirit is inviting us into. Thank you, God, for the work of this Episcopal Church in Connecticut, for Ranjit, for his ability and willingness to be here, for all of what we bring, all of what we will learn. Give you thanks for calling us forward into this community and into all the possibilities of this present day. I pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Gail, you have been instrumental in this invitation to Ranjit. Thank you for being here, Ranjit, and thank you for give us some context for what we're doing tonight. And I'll tag it at the very end of tonight to just give us some context for where we're going with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Daniel, and thank you to all of you for coming. I first met Ranjit through when I became a member of the ECCT, which is the diocesan group that is dealing with, we have a team of members from different churches, both priests and laity, who are dealing with the issue of racial healing and reconciliation. And from this church, Bob Giolito and myself were asked to join about 2 years ago. And what it did for me was to give me a bigger, I would say a more panoramic view of what was happening at the diocesan level on this issue, and to recognize that we were not alone, that there were many parishes who were yet to start work. There were parishes who were way ahead of us, but it gave me a lot of motivation and inspiration from our monthly meetings, and we just had one of our quarterly meetings. And Ranjit was introduced as the canon for advocacy, racial justice, and reconciliation in the diocese, and all this work comes under him. And I thought it would be a good idea, as we are about to start, in large measure, because some of the people in this room, and I'll ask you to put up your hands so that we know who you are working with me on the history project. Lamont is one, and David is another. And we've been doing a lot of research into our history as a parish and our history with slavery and what that means, how we've gotten to where we've gotten over a large period of time. We are now at this point in time ready to draft our very first chapter, which will look at what happened in the pre-colonial times before we even got to this point. There's a lot more to go, but I think we're very proud of the fact that in I would say probably about 6 months, just about, we have been able to get to this stage. We've done a lot of reading, we're doing a lot of research. We have walked in and looked at some of the registers, for example, that belong to this parish, that go all the way back, old vestry meetings, what people said. We've even taken part with Wilton, because they are doing what is called a witness stones project, where they have identified an enslaved person that they plan to honor. And we are participating with them because Sharon, who is the person spearheading that effort, is working with us. And that's been also a nice crossover, because one of the things we discovered is that the history of this church is very tied to the history of not just St. Matthews, but the history of slavery in Wilton and in Norwalk. So it's against that backdrop that we decided that it would be good to have Ranjit come and speak with us, so that we have a sense of what the diocese is looking at in looking at asking parishes to undertake their history. And that then morphed into a whole lot of other things as groups began to do sacred ground, because sacred ground covers a lot of the things that we have covered in other areas. Those of us who belong to Race and Social Coalition, Justice Coalition, for example, have done a lot of reading around the same themes. Those who went to the Lenten series also covered some of the same material. And so on the 13th, we're going to look at, okay, we've done a lot of reading, we've done a lot of research. What are we going to do with all that? And we thought that perhaps having Ranjit come here and give us a sense of what the diocese is hoping to achieve and where we as a church stand in conjunction to that, we thought that would be useful. So Ranjit, without more ado, let me introduce you and have you come and speak with us. You're welcome.
I'm just really grateful to Father Daniel and to Gail for inviting me to come, and especially to all of you, particularly the vestry. We were supposed to meet at 6 o'clock, and I had forgotten that my son had a small graduation from 4 to 5 o'clock. It's not a big graduation, but graduating from 5th grade to 6th grade, and I just really wanted to be there. I didn't want to miss those sort of things, and so I'm so grateful that you all were gracious enough to move it to 6:30. So thank you for that. I know we all have busy lives. I know that. So thank you. I'm really excited to be here. As I take my coat off, I really am. I'm excited more so around conversation, more than me speaking. But I hope it can be a mix of both. And I hope you'll also stop me as I talk, and so we can go a little bit deeper on different things, if that makes sense. Yeah. And if you're able, because I do better like with names, if you're able to share with me your name, that'll be really great. So that when we see each other at different dioceses and stuff, we can know each other, and that's a big thing for me. Just knowing each other, that's everything. So Ranjit Matthews, as Gail, Sharon, Daniel said, I'm trying to think of how to begin this. In 2020, as you all know, and we're coming up now over 3 years since the murder, and I'd say the lynching of George Floyd. And I think within that broader understanding, within our church, there was a deep sense that the church needed to be more of a advocate with respect to racial justice. And so, a group of people came up with this huge resolution, which was called Resolution 7 in 2020, which was really, and we can share that more broadly a little bit later. But that's a set of about 9 resolves that was at diocesan convention either in October or November of that year was agreed upon. And if we're able, maybe after we can share that resolution. It's a pretty lengthy results, right? And included in it is any of the number of things that Gail shared, right? So one of which is not encouraging, but requiring that vestry members, the clergy, staff members, those who are going to be elected to diocesan-wide bodies like a donation and bequests, like a standing committee, commission on ministry, or mission council, had to move through what we call dismantling racism training, right? So it was a requirement. Usually within dioceses, we encourage people to do it, right? We encourage people to do it, and often, more often than not, folks don't do it until there's some sort of, and I don't like this term, some sort of accountability measure. And so that's what we've been trying to do. And one of the resolves was to call for my position, canon for mission advocacy, racial justice, and reconciliation, to help be what I would call like a midwife for parishes to do this work. And, you know, Bishop Jeff has been really strong in saying that he sees this work really as a lens, right? Not as some sort of program to take on, but really a lens for, you know, our broader society, realizing that America is a racist country, right? And so there are racist institutions. So how do we become anti-racist, right? And so one of the things that I've been tasked to do, and I'll just go through that big, broad scope and then see the ways in which, you know, we can connect more broadly. One of the ways that I've been given a little bit of money, right? Quite a bit of money. And what I do is I invite different organizations to offer anti-racism training for lay, clergy, all the folks of ECCT. And so that ranges from a different number of groups like Visions Incorporated or the Kaleidoscope Institute, or the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, or as we're doing now, walking with Dr. Christina Cleveland on a cultural level. So inviting parishes to take any one of these courses or trainings, right? Saying that this is important to do. This is actually all that the diocese said. We said this and we committed to it. Delegates from parishes such as St. Paul's on the Green here in Norwalk sent 2 delegates, right, to that convention and said, yes, this is what we're about, right? So it was a diocesan-wide resolution. So part of that has been creating these sort of spaces and looking at racism in particular around a cultural level, an institutional level, an interpersonal level, and a personal level. So those 4 phases in which racism hits me or touches me. Does that make sense?
What are the 4 again?
Cultural, institutional, interpersonal, and personal. Right? The ways in which, you know, racism touches our lives on a personal level, on an institutional level, cultural level, and those 4 particular ways. So that's what we're doing now. We're sharing this more broadly through email, through conversation, but come and take a training. Now, our hope is that while 2 of these, well, actually, one of the offerings that the diocese is giving, that my office is offering, is secular. We wanna create our own anti-racism training, right? Something that pays attention to the context of Connecticut, right? So all the realities of Connecticut, right? The realities of how we've been in relationship with our First Nation people, our indigenous people, right? All those are singularly different than other states, for example. Does that make sense? So we're in the process of asking, and thank you, Father Daniel, is going to pass out the resolution 7. But we want to realize that if we're going to do this work, how is confronting racism, how is it born out of our faith, right? This isn't something that we're taking from the outside, but that is deeply rooted to how we follow the way of Jesus, right? None of this is not connected to that. All of it is because of our commitment. All of it is because of our commitment and the vows that we take in our baptismal covenant, right? They're not some secular thing that we're being invited into, right? How do we realize and respect the dignity of all people? How do we confront evil in our society? How do we work for justice and peace in our society? All those particular vows are wrapped up in this work, right? How do we see people who we claim as Episcopalians are made in the image of God? Wherein which many of our systems say the direct opposite, if we look writ large, right? So this work, friends, is Christian, right? This work is part of how we become more faithful to the way of Jesus. So this practice that we're going to do, that we're training people on, is with a community that's called the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. Now, Absalom Jones was the first African-American Episcopal priest, right? Ordained in Philadelphia, right? But we're using the Absalom Jones Center, which is based in Atlanta, because it is faith-based, right? We will start the training off either through our the baptismal covenant or the Eucharist. So we're drawing people in through their connection to the Eucharist or the baptismal covenant. So we're using a language of faith to meet people where they are. Does that make sense? This is not something, again, that is language that is disassociated from us, but it's language that we practice and use on a day-to-day level, right? So that's something that's a training that that we hopefully will use throughout the diocese for years to come. So right now we're training 10 people within this sort of Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. And that'll begin actually we'll begin that training on June 27th. Realizing that we don't want to go outside of ourselves, but all of the gifts of this, they're here within us. And we don't need to pay other people to do it. We can do this work ourselves. Right? Ken. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. So actually, Dr. Catherine Meeks, who is the executive director of the Absalom Jones, she is teaching us, and she's doing this all online. So for the course of probably 10 sessions, for about 2 hours every month, she'll teach us. And then those trainers will be fully equipped to go about this work and offer maybe a day-long training to Episcopalians all across Connecticut. You know, oftentimes what we'll hear is, how is this work connected to our faith? And that's why we've chosen very intentionally to be focused either, and we have to pick. Do we want to focus with respect to the Eucharist, or do we want to focus with respect to the baptismal covenant, right? All of which are, we understand what both of those things are, right? Does this make sense? So that, if we were to look at one thing within my portfolio, dreaming up an anti-racism training for us as Episcopalians here in Connecticut, that's one part of it. Okay? So over the past year and 9 months, that is the work that I've been doing. But still offering the Kaleidoscope Institute, Visions Incorporated, and other things to help people move through this resolve that came from this convention resolution. Does that make sense?
Can you repeat whatever anyone says? No one can hear that.
Right. So, for example, Visions Incorporated is an organization, a nonprofit that's based in Boston, Massachusetts. And for 12 years, Ian Douglas, our diocesan bishop past, he was deeply connected to Visions. And so he drew in Visions Incorporated. And they do a lot of work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? But they do it from not from a faith perspective, right? They do it from, really a more secular perspective. But that's been a program that's been helpful to Episcopalians all across Connecticut, right? But it hasn't been specifically faith-based, right? And so as we offer these trainings to people to help them with language, to help them personally, interpersonally, to move within their parishes, it's one option. It's not the option that I would want, but over the past 2 years, I want something that's faith-based. Yeah, David.
How does this training that you
So
So I'm going to repeat that.
No, thank
Marcia's
you.
saying that, or you can repeat that question. How does this mesh with what people are doing in Sacred Ground?
So Sacred Ground completely counts, in terms of our understanding of what would be a training that is anti-racist, right? That would help us lean into the way of Jesus. So we're inviting parishes, irrespective of where you are, to move through this training, right? We are offering on a diocesan level trainings that are free, right? And now if a parish wants to move through, whatever training it is, maybe, and if they want to do that on their own behalf, maybe that'll cost a little bit of money. From the diocese, this is all free training. But Sacred Ground would be one sort of training that could fulfill this work. Yeah, and that's offered from on the church-wide level, right? So a lot of dioceses are also doing it. We just want people to do the work and to let my office know that particular people are moving through it, right? So my assistant Bernice sort of holds certificates of people who have moved through this. So with the hope that more generally, we are building a group of people who could share a language, right? And share a way of being as we move forward to be more faithful to the gospel, right? So, and I look at this as Connecticut, right? In the sense that we have 95, we have 91, we have 84, we have 15, all these routes. And then, some people are more on the highway, right, with respect to this work. And some parishes are more, it's a little harder to get to. You know what I mean? Because maybe this work is a little bit harder to do, right? Because we're all on different stages of this work. So our hope, my office is to meet parishes where they are, right? Not to say, oh, they're so bad, why aren't you here? No, meet every parish where they are and walk and be a companion. And so that's really where my office is. It's not no shame, no blame, none of that. But it's just to gently say, okay, here you are. How can we take a step forward together? Yeah.
Sacred Ground, Ranjit, Sacred Ground and the training that you're offering in parishes do both at the same time. Sacred Ground is a huge commitment. It's, 11 sessions. So
Right.
how many sessions are, your training offers? How do they compare in terms of time commitment? I think that might be helpful for folks.
Yeah. So I would, in all honesty, folks here at St. Paul's, on the Green, if you're moving through Sacred Ground, that's a profound commitment. A Kaleidoscope Institute, and I want to go much more than this, okay? And we're getting into the nitty-gritty here, but Kaleidoscope Institute, for example, is just over 2 weekends, right? And Visions is just a day and a half, right? Whereas Sacred Ground, it's 11 sessions. Now, we have this work and we haven't yet trained these people in this particular training, right? That I want people to do. So in the meantime, I want to invite people, Episcopalians all across our diocese, to at least take a step. And that could be Sacred Ground, that could be Visions, that could be Kaleidoscope, but take a faithful step, right? And with the sense, and this is for me, is that we really lean into our own wholeness in God when we do. You know, how are we separate from one another? How are we not leaning into the fullness of the gospel by not doing this work? You know, relegating this work to people, to other people, but not ourselves. Right? And so, you know, it's the invitation again to all parishes to do it. And again, no shame or blame, but just an invitation, right? So that is one portion, this training, right? Does it make sense? Parishes can lean into a particular training that they wish to do. But it would be nice if they sort of reach out also to me and just let me know, you know, what y'all are doing. You know, not any like, you can't do that, but just like, it's good to know. And it's good also to share more broadly what different parishes are doing, you know, throughout our diocese. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Faith-based as opposed to the first program you mentioned out of Boston.
Visions, yeah.
Visions, that you said was more secular based.
Yeah.
Can you explain what Kaleidoscope is?
Oh, Kaleidoscope is definitely faith-based. You know, it was created by an Episcopal priest by the name of the Reverend Eric Law, who created the Kaleidoscope Center, which focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and now offers throughout the country, throughout the churches, and I think even beyond the Episcopal Church, these trainings to allow people to recognize that we come at this through our faith. So, I mean, it's a wonderful, real opportunity to, if you're interested in this work, to move through that. And it's just a Saturday, a Sunday, and another Saturday and Sunday. But I don't want to just say that. For me, what's important is that this is not something where we tick off the box, but that it leads to our own transformation. That for me is everything. This is not some like, oh, we got to just do this, but we're being transformed in all of it. If my heart is open, like I know that I am deeply racist, I'm a misogynist, I'm homophobic, and I'm classist. I know that. I've been socialized in that way. I've been conditioned in that way. I think of myself sometimes as a means of production. You know, like if I were to, you know, after 2 o'clock on a Monday or a Tuesday, and there's this yearning inside my body to say, you know, I need a nap, right? I don't know if so many of you all have been there, but I power through because I recognize that production and wringing enough of Ranjit out of me is so important. So this is also on a cultural level, if you hear me, right? I'll speak for myself. I've been socialized within these broader systems, and my life has been so tethered to them, right? So how do I repent from out of that, and meaning a turning, and turn to something that's more life-giving, right? And so I know that within my body, I have tendencies around certain systems. I know that I worship them more than I worship God. That's the truth. So thank God for the confession on Sunday morning. I'm not joking. I'm not laughing or joking. But how many of us can be that honest? How many of us can be that honest about how we're ruled in our lives? And I think that's what I want to get at as your canon. To be honest about our lives and how we can live lives that are more full and robust and of the Spirit, right? Not caught up in white supremacy. Now, I'm veering off topic, but I've covered one part of it, and that's the trainings, okay? Second part of it of what we do, are we clear on the trainings? And we can go back to that. The second part of what we do is my colleague Amber Page Gear and I, who is a diocesan transition minister, we go to parishes that are seeking priests in charges or rectors, and we meet with them for about 2 hours in what we call unconscious bias training. unconscious bias. Because I know I commit things, I have all of these biases, right? Who am I looking for? Over the years of the church, we've looked for straight, white, cis men, right? Well, and what are these blinders? What are they missing? What am I missing? More generally speaking. So this unconscious bias training helps us, for me to see these blinders that I have on. Right? For 2 hours, we held vestries. So we just did it on Thursday with 2 parishes, helping them move through a PowerPoint presentation saying like, oh, that's true. Those are realities, right? And there's no shame or blame, but it's just helping us pay more attention. Because I know, friends, that I have blinders. Does anybody else have blinders or just me? Yeah, yeah. Yes. Let me just speak quickly. Like my cultural background is, my parents are from South India, and we don't talk a lot about that kind of stuff. And there's a heightened sense that, men don't have to do a lot, right? We're given so much. So even when I was, when I was in college and I came home and I had my girlfriend and my mother was doing a lot of dishes and we were doing the dishes that evening, right? And so my girlfriend at the time who just pushed me and she said, Ranjit, why don't you do the dishes? And, I was 22 or something like that. And I was she did it in a shaming way, which wasn't the best way to do it. But it was sort of like, it alerted me to all the privilege that I've been holding as an Indian American male. That's such a prosaic sort of whatever example. And it helped me open my eyes about my own privilege that I carry. And so this unconscious bias training for 2 hours is helping vestries be like, oh, this very holy process that each, vestry is moving through to be like, okay, maybe we'll pay attention to that in the future, right? So we do that with every parish that is looking for a priest in charge or a rector. And that started with that resolve. That's a second resolve or a third resolve there. Does it make sense? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Very important subject. And I've been through many of these before and I hear the word training. But what I'm concerned about is how will we know when we're successful? Could you describe success to us?
Woo. Well, no, that's a fantastic, thank you. For me, that's it. And this is something that we were asking at our bishops and canons offsite a week and a half ago, or at least I was asking. How do we know when we're successful, right? And maybe we'll know it. Maybe we won't. I would say that this is Bishop Jeff also said, it's a lifelong, right? This is no off place. So, I'm finally done with that. It's ongoing, and I think we can only know that in the level of accountability that we have with our friends. So hopefully we'll call up to it. But it's a great question. I don't know when we're going to do it. But it's important. So how do we look at these trainings and ask people, how do I look at it as the canon to be like, okay, well, what is the difference now? What is the delta between how somebody was acting before and how I'm acting now, right? So that's something that we haven't yet figured out. Yeah.
Except I think that there are ways in which you can tell if you look at vestries, for example, if you've done the training the way you should be doing it, or if you've done the reading, then it means the next time you choose a new class of vestry, you will go into that process with collective unconscious bias out in the open, as opposed to not talking about it at all.
What one would hope.
One would hope.
No, Gail, I mean,
That's right.
you know, I think more than anything, this is all about how a vestry moves together, right? Is it vulnerable enough to create a community of like openness and honesty around, well, you know, Ranjit, you missed out there, but I love you. And there's grace within a space to like call each other to account, which I think is what that sort of modeling we need out in the broader world. If I don't say, I'd say. Yeah, there's somebody else who had a question or no? I move on. Now, you all had, that was a second part of what I do, okay? A third part of what I do is work with Greg Farr, who I think met with the History Project people, yeah. And that is around, and you know, honestly, every 3 months that we do this with parishes, we've only been able to like gather maybe 9 archivists or historians from across our 152 parishes. But you know, that's okay. You know, our hope is that to allow space where historians and archivists can do that digging of our particular histories and draw that history into vestries to say, well, what does this look like? And how is this? And to sit with it. So much of white supremacist culture is not being able to sit with uncomfortable things. Right? I know it within me because I'm a white supremacist. Right? It's built in within me. Like I don't want something that's uncomfortable to talk about. That's why on Thanksgiving dinner we do not lean into hard things. Right? We don't. Right? Let's talk about anything else other than things that really matter to us. That's the training and the socialization that I've moved into. So this is so much bigger than a training. This is my own socialization of how I've been brought up. Now, who is a perfectionist here? Anybody? Yeah. And this is what we name. This is, folks, this is what we name here, right? And maybe we do this within our vestries and churches about perfection, right? Oh, that's perfect. That's great. Perfection is a mathematical equation. It has nothing to do with humanity. And yet so often we hold each other to this sense of perfection. And maybe that needs to work for being an engineer, right? But of our humanity, I'm not perfect, right? But it's not just these trainings and the head stuff. It's these norms that we walk through that need to be challenged, right? Like how do we challenge, particularly men in New England, call us all out, the stiff upper lip, right? Because I can't have any emotion, right? How dare a man have some emotion and cry? Nope. Come on, right? How rare is it that we see a man cry in New England? Right? I know that I've been trained to not do that. To Ranjit, you need to be strong. Maybe I've been socialized into that. And that's all part of white supremacy culture. And not just white people, all of us have been trained within that. And so part of this work as canon for advocacy, racial justice, and reconciliation is to push back against those norms so that we can be more whole people, right? We don't need to carry on these carcasses, these prejudices, these ways of being that maybe haven't been as liberatory as they could be, right? It isn't just about the lynching of George Floyd. There have been incredible amounts of lynchings all across our history. But it's also about these norms of white supremacy that have been built up in London and maybe in some of us here, right? And how do we connote and how do we repent and turn to the gospel? That's a big project. That's a big and one way that and I'll get to the other things, but one way that I think we do that is by cultivating vulnerability, right? And even a sense of grieving. I mean, we can go through the theology of reparations on a different on a different date. But, how do we create space within our churches, which are supposed to be the bodies of Christ, right? Where we hold one another, where people can be vulnerable to one another. Of maybe sharing a little bit of emotion. I know I would love that. Where Ranjit doesn't need to be perfect, but can just show up as himself and have some grace for one another. I mean, what else is the church for? Right? So folks, this is not on a didactic head level only. Right? This is deeply something of the body. And Plato and duality have cut us off from our heads to the bodies, right? It's only the head. We only love the head, right? We only love people who've gone to Harvard and Yale and all that. We're all so head-based. But we've cut off our bodies. And so much of our stress, more broadly, is drawn in our bodies. But we don't talk about that and our bodily wisdom, right? How dare anybody talk about the body in church, right? Because that's a little bit, right? So yeah, that's a little touching. So these are the norms that we've sort of moved into that need to be questioned and pushed back, right? So that we can be more whole people. But this is also the work. It isn't just to do a damn training. No. It's about transformation and Ranjit becoming more whole in me. Yeah, go ahead.
How do you relate this to trauma?
Yeah.
Because I have been introduced to the author. The name of the book is
Yeah, Resma Menakem.
Sorry.
Resma Menakem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. And he said that we're all trauma.
Absolutely.
Black voices, white voices, security, police, we're all traumatized. And so when I hear you,
I don't need much.
no,
All right, okay, sorry. So I'll start again. Mention, is his name?
Menakem.
He's a black psychotherapist.
Right.
And he argues that we all are traumatized. Black voices, white voices, and the police. They were all traumatized.
Yeah.
And I related that. You were talking about going into the body.
Yeah.
We carry that in our nerves.
Woo.
Whoa, we carry it.
Yes.
And we don't want to be talking about something that is too sensitive.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just raised the word trauma.
Absolutely. Sorry, I forgot your name. Lamont was just talking about trauma and how much trauma we pass on. And I say it in my family, how can I be an alchemist for my boys? That I'm not carrying on what, love my parents. I do love them. And, maybe they could have talked a little bit about this some more. Or maybe they could have spoken a little bit about sexuality. And they did not talk about any of that. Right? So then how is my relationship with my body? There was nothing. How can I be an alchemist then for my boys and say like, well, I can stop that and do something different, right? And that's just something little, but how much do we pass? I mean, I'm no expert in trauma, but that's also something that we all carry on from our families, right? So, more than anything, I would say, as parishes is how do we create not a safe space, okay, and so often, but a brave space, right? Like a brave space where, and this is the place to do it, right? But that'll take a lot of time, and that's okay. Part of white supremacy culture is like this sense of urgency. We got to complete it. We got to finish it. We got to do it. No, my friends, this work takes time. right? It takes a long time if I'm honest with myself. And how can we take a step, right? And if it's around trauma, how do we invite somebody who's maybe a trauma-based specialist to come in and talk about that? But holding each other within a theology of grace and gentleness towards one another is, I think, the biggest thing, right? It took us 400 years to get to this point. We're not going to finish this next year, right? And preachers haven't preached on this for a long time. And this is part of the reason why we're here. That's telling the truth, right? Because we're so scared of losing the pledges, etc. Right? So, but this is the time to do that, because maybe we can midwife a new way of being, right? But that'll take a space where we're able to share some truths with one another in a space of grace. So part of what we're going to do with a task force on reparations is they're going to offer space through our region missionaries to hold space where people can come for a truth-telling session, right? Within our regions, and create space. Because, if you look at our task force on reparations, which happened about 2 years ago, you have a lot of people, who are on that task. Some people on task force who are saying, listen, how long have we been waiting for reparations? Right? And then there may be another group on the other side of the task force who may be also saying, well, we need to move through a sense of truth and reconciliation before we're able to get to reparations, right? If we're honest around the theology of it, right? How do we invite people to show up? And that's hard, because we don't talk about race. We're scared of it. And maybe it's because of my own shame around it, right? So let me just get to the other parts of my position. I've named the training. I've named this unconscious bias. I've named this work with Greg Farr is all about inviting historians to do this careful work of looking at their history of enslavement, right? And then being able to invite other historians from across the diocese to come and join that work. Now we're doing this in fits and starts, because, friends, this is a language that we're just barely understanding, right? It's not as if we've been doing this for years. No, right? But how can we invite more and more people from different parishes to say, hey, Gail, we've been doing this for a little bit, and maybe asking, another parish that's sort of adjacent to say, come and see what we're doing, right? And maybe there's a chance that we can learn something from that, right? And that will take a long time. 152 parishes being able to name their story of how, maybe, but also naming that there were probably abolitionists within respective parishes who were fighting against slavery. How do we lift up their voices and maybe take that spirit that they had into this work that we're doing? So this is not just about seeing how, our forefathers, foremothers, forepeople fell short, but also the spaces in which we were sort of doing some good work, right? But how can we be whole, but we need to tell the whole story and not just leave out some. So that practice is going to be imperfect, right? We're going to fall down. We're going to say things that might hurt each other, but how do we come back and still be with one another is mine, right? No perfection. I'm imperfect. Maybe some of us are also imperfect, and we can do this work together, albeit maybe at a snail's pace. And that's hard. That's hard maybe for some members of our broader community who are people of color. Maybe our African-American folks in parishes who might yearn for something deeper and more profound from the diocese. And yet we go as a diocese, right? And so my work with them is to say, this is also sort of our reality here. And how do we work with them to go together? So every parish is distinctly on a different stage of this journey. All 152 of us. Right, and so my hope is that there's a liminality of each body of Christ to be able to be like, let's take a step together and work together on that. That's the racial justice stuff. The advocacy bit, let me get to it, is around, profound questions of income inequality here in Connecticut, of which there's profound levels of income inequality. There's profound levels of lack of affordable housing. So working with different groups within Connecticut to, how do we do some community organizing so we can, lobby our representatives to create more space, for, and Connecticut is a space of profound inequality, particularly for our people of color, right? And red zones and, all these sorts of things. So my office does some work with other collaborative faith-based group and not faith-based groups to like lobby our representatives around these particular issues. Around, for example, environmental racism, right? Of which there's any number of spaces within our state, which are places of environmental racism. So there are any number of spaces that we look at. And I think the challenge is that on a number of levels, this work can be about, can feel like it's challenging, right? On any number of the parishes. And then people will say to me, Ranjit, and this happened to me yesterday in Southern, when I was offering a conversation. One of the things I talk about is, aren't you being political? And to which I'll say, yes, everything that we do is political. It just comes from polis, which is the Greek, right, of the people. But we're not partisan, right? We're not partisan. We're not for the Democratic Party, we're not for the Republican Party, we're not for the Independent, but we are political people. Everything that Jesus did was a political thing. Everything. I'm sure there's tons of things that St. Paul's in the Green is doing that are political, but not partisan. And that has been one of the spaces in which, when I walk into a parish, like, oh, he said that. No, we should feel okay in saying that actually this is political, but it's not partisan. Does that make sense? It's not partisan. We need to call Democrats, Republicans, and Independents to the floor because they all fall short of the gospel. And we say it in our Eucharistic prayer, the principalities and rulers, right? And they all bow down to Jesus. Does it make sense? Hard to do, but that is our call as Christians. Anyways, go ahead. Any questions or thoughts or provocations of what I've shared? Can you call upon me as your friend in the diocese? How can I work with St. Paul's? Not feel like, but I'm here. Does what I'm saying makes a little bit of sense? Yeah. And
that, because that has always, that distinction has meant a lot to me, but when literal or symbolic flags get partisanized. So, the US flag right now, when I see the US flag, I have a reaction, especially if it's on a bumper sticker or if it's all over somebody's, or there's 12 of them. It is like, oh, I know what that means. It means Republican. What? How did that happen? And the same thing happens with the Black Lives Matter flag. That has, the flag that we fly is signals to some a total partisan stance. Like, well, you're just a bunch of flaming Democrats who aren't even, and the Republicans in this congregation feel that. They feel silenced and they feel suppressed, feel afraid to talk about themselves and their positions. I know that. So it's, that creating brave space. My question is, how do you make it safe enough to be brave? Because I think you're onto something. It's not about let's just have a safe space, but how do we have brave space? And that takes making it safe enough for people who have said, I'm not so sure I dare say my name or say my experience. People of color have experiences in this parish. I'm not saying anything you haven't said to me that surprises me. But when they're talking off the mic, they'll say, this is what happens to me at coffee hour. And I've been coming here for 20 years. Actually, Donna, I'm going to call you out because you've said this so many times. She's like, there's not a week that goes by that I hear something and somebody says something to me and I say, do you realize what you're saying? So there is this, I want it safe enough so Donna can say, okay, here's what I heard. And Republican voters can do the same thing, saying, here's how I feel. And then we can start to de-partisanize, right? And say, okay, here's how Jesus is political with everything he says. Let's go be political and not get snagged by the tripwires.
And I would say, Father Daniel, just in this particular season of our country, how do we lean into that tension? And not cede that space of a tension-filled space, right? It's Thanksgiving dinner, right? How do we fully be ourselves and extend our hand of love towards our people, right? In a place where we claim to be about grace and we claim to actually recognize that everybody's made in the image of God. We say that so easily. I know I do. Made in the image of God. Well, what does that mean when I disagree with you? How can, for this space, how can a church be the exact space that we need in this country right now to do that hard work where we're just seeing like this so often, right? But I do think, Father Daniel, I do think that it means cultivating a place where people don't feel shamed. And I do think these guidelines of mutuality do provide a good template for that. Does everybody know that, the guidelines of mutuality? Yeah.
There's still a stage I couldn't rattle them all off. I could, by instinct, get to most of them, but yeah. But the things, you all know them. It's like make I statements instead of people say, or you think, you should think, that kind of thing. And no shaming, no blaming. It's okay to disagree. All that stuff that our grandmothers taught us, and we still need it on a bookmark to say, oh yeah, that's right.
The thing I think about that is that, it's moving those guidelines beyond just the vestry, for example, because that's where you see it most, because the vestry has to, work together in a certain kind of way. So, the guidelines is given to them, but the ordinary person sitting in the pew doesn't think about, mutuality at all.
Yeah.
Exactly. On the other hand, I think there is a need for that to happen. If in order to make your faith move beyond just coming in on a Sunday morning and having communion.
Yeah.
In order for it to move beyond that and mean something, then those mutuality guidelines need to be practiced by everybody,
right.
And I think, for example, on what day was it this week? Lost track of time. On Thursday, was it that we had Saturday, we had a quarterly meeting. And this is the team from the diocese that looks at racial healing and reconciliation. And one of the things we were looking at, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm backing you guys. Yeah, one of the things we were looking at was how you deal with teaching children in Sunday school and other parts of, the church. How do you bring little kids into our faith tradition? And the priest who gave it, who spoke, I'm praying will come here to speak to us, because I thought she was amazing. She talked about little things that you don't think about. Like she said, she looked around one day and realized that a lot of the kids who come through the door of the place where she was, there was nothing representing them. And she was looking at the creche that they had for Christmas. And she thought, there's something not right about this creche. Everybody in Mary, the baby, they're all right. And so she decided that she was going to do something about it. And so she got these figures that were all wooden, and looked completely different. So that kids walking in could actually think, this might look like me, and so her thing is, if you really practice radical welcome, those are things you have to look at. What are the books that you give to kids when they come in? If even they're not participating in the service, there are books that you can give them, picture books that they can look at, that carry very different messages. And that's stuff that we haven't looked at all. But it was interesting to see that somebody had, she has done all this curriculum and looked at not just children of 5 to 8, but looked at it from 0 back all the way up, and I thought that was interesting. And that to me is how the Spirit works on this book and how it moves through it, that it moves from reading to actually doing things that make sense, and that show that kind of transformation, and you were there, so you can talk to it as well, but that's how it struck me.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing? So often I think leaning into these discussions with a big group can be really hard. I know for me. And I wonder here at St. Paul's, around, small groups, a cultivation of that around, a brave or a fierce space where we share stories, right? And we can push back against stories, right? The stories are our own, but it's the way of Jesus, right? In his parables. And how do we share stories with one another that we hear on a different space, right? It's not statistics, it's not this and this, but it's lived people's lived realities, right? And so, I would, as something just to offer, is those creation of those sort of small group spaces. And maybe it's also sharing some of the shame that we're carrying around some of this, right? And because we all carry some shame around this, race-based shame, and it's in that cultivation and vulnerability that we develop a trust for one another, right? And those are easy words to say, but when we actually live into it, it is profound. So I want to offer that as as a parish, how do we create those spaces to do that? Sorry.
I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but I'm so grateful that you're here. And, the path that I'm on to become anti-racist, I think started when I came into the doors of St. Paul's to the compline service. And, it's through the strength and courage of my friends here at St. Paul's that give me strength and courage to talk about this. And thank you for your honesty. And yes, I am a recovering perfectionist.
Yeah, amen. Just to
But
meet
I
you.
just have to share this, okay? So, my brother, kind of on the conservative side. Oh, before I say that, it's through, people planted a seed in me
Mm.
and that seed has been growing.
Mm.
And so I planted that seed with my brother.
Mm.
He's having a lot of, chronic illness right now.
Mm.
And I sent him this positive affirmation and I was really afraid about how he would respond to it. Like maybe would, dismiss it sort of thing. It was a spiritual affirmation. And he actually texted me. He's like, thank you so much. This helped me so much. And
next to my friend here. My question is, how do we bring in people who don't agree with us? I mean, as I look around this group, we are, the expression preaching to the choir. We are the choir. And how do we get into those difficult conversations with other people in our parish? How do we make that comfortable? How do we make that work?
Yeah, and I'm no expert on St. Paul's and the Green, but I honestly believe that it requires vulnerability. What's your name? What, Jane? Ginny. Ginny, I honestly believe it requires vulnerability on your part, Ginny, to be able to reach out to that person that you disagree with and to sit down, not to change their mind, but to hear them and to listen from zero is what I'd call it. Listen with no sense of like having a rebuttal, but just, and not for the sake of anything, Ginny, not for the sake of changing their mind around a particular policy, but recognizing their humanity, recognizing that they're made in the image of God. And I think we leave everything else to God. I don't know, I haven't changed any people's minds, but I've tried to show up in my vulnerability, recognizing that I have fallen short continually and continue to do so. And maybe, just maybe, that might invite them to show up as themselves also. But if we do not show up with our vulnerability, I can't imagine they'd want to show up either. And I would say it's all about invitation there. That there is so much deep relational capital by just being with one another. I mean, that's and leave the rest, Ginny. That sounds so cliche, but what else do we have? Yeah.
So, Ranjit, you talked about creating safe space for people in the parish. I think that we have offered that to them and we continue to offer that through Sacred Ground. And I think during Sacred Ground, that's a safe space where people are able to tell their stories, to talk about some of the things that they didn't know about themselves, or to talk about their experiences. So we are creating that Circle 4 now, so hopefully it's our hope that we can get more people in the congregation to join us. And I think that's the challenge, because the people who are coming now are people who are in the choir, you know, so to speak. But we are trying to do the work, and it's a journey, but hopefully others join.
Yeah, I think learning.
Martha.
Marvel. I think there's so much power in like going to one person and inviting them to come. I know I am moved when somebody takes the time to say, you know, Ranjit, we'd love to have you. It means a lot. And of course, that's so biblical and theological. It's what we see all throughout the New Testament of an invitation or that one-on-one sort of transformation. Barbara, that's all I got for that one. You know, I honestly, I don't know, other than enlarging the circle and continuing to do our work and always inviting, maybe that one seed sometime will come, you know, I'll come and see about it. I don't have anything else other than that. I think.
Yeah. And the importance of truth telling. It's one of the things that we hope to do with the street project is to begin to have parishioners that we will keep there. Anybody who 20 years can go back to it and hear what the in the parish, what they came into, what they experienced, what they know.
Yeah. You know, there was the former dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union. Her name is Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. It was written a host of number of books. Back in 2018, when I was fairly new to the Episcopal Church of Connecticut, she came and spoke to the clergy at a clergy conference about how this time in 2018 was a Kairos moment. And Kairos sort of meaning sort of God's time, an opportune time. And that was 2018. And I still feel there is space around it, you know, because I think, I'll say two things. I think we've, for too long, you know, we have been afraid to tell the truth around some of our systemic realities here in this country, just for fear. But because of that fear, and because we haven't spoken those truths, we've allowed it to be covered over. And when we've covered it over, we're covering people over. And we're not telling the truth about systemic injustice. And what happens to us, I think, is that we end up corroding ourselves and corroding our body politic. What I imagine happened is that there was an apocalypse that happened and is happening. An apocalypse, I just mean an unveiling that is happening. That's what only apocalypse means, really. It means unveiling. And some of these things are being lifted up that have been covered over. And there are ways in which we've been lulled into not telling the truth or not being, you know, not wanting to be confrontational, or that's not even the right word, not wanting to ask uncomfortable questions. And that lulling, that gentle lulling has got us to this place, right, where we're so disparate and away from each other. And what chance that we have now as a church to be a place where we can tell the truth about our lived realities, right? And because for so long, Gail, we've built up this edifice in this country of not fully telling the truth, we're at the place that we are, right? And I do not imagine that it's going to be like, oh, thank you for telling us that. It's hard, but we've built up this edifice for hundreds of years. What else can we, but are we bold enough? Are we brave enough to create space within the church to tell the truth, right? And if it's not us, who will it be? The government is not going to create some safe truth-telling space, right? It's not going to be a nonprofit that does that. What about the prophetic mantle of the church to create it, right? And it'll come with eggs that will be cracked. But that's again, leaving aside the imperfection and leading into something that could be life-giving, right? So I just think it's so incredibly important. And it will be messy, Gail. I don't imagine it would be. But if we can lead and tell our truth connected to our stories, how can that be refuted? But I don't think we've done that well as a church. Yeah. But I also think we have the theological, we have a theological tool called lamentation, right? Where we can lament. And how do we create space at St. Paul's and in the diocese writ large for a space of grief? And when we create that space for grief, truth comes out, right? But if we first, it's like people who just want to just go to reconciliation, right? Let's be reconciled. No, we first need these things to get to reconciliation. And one of those theological tools is lamentation, Gail. How does St. Paul's on the Green become a space of lamentation where people can share their grief over how tethered they are to systems, right? And what it has done to their family, right? Grief work, I think, is just really important to that truth-telling.
supports a lot of what you're saying. So I'm glad that you are who you are. My father was a Episcopal minister, and I can't imagine 50 years ago talking about this kind of stuff with the Episcopal Church. Thank you.
We don't need this anymore. Part of it died, and so now we're just, iPhone is using its mic.
Is there anybody else who has a question or provocation or thought? Friends, I don't join as a master or some expert, but I join with some practitioner who has a little bit of experience and wants to join me in work, you know, and wants to come alongside us. This is some of how your common mission support here at St. Paul's on the Green comes to, you know, when you send some money in to the diocese, right? This is some of the work that we're doing, and there's a lot of other stuff which, you know, St. Paul's on the Greens can be supported in different ways. We're just here at the diocese in all sorts of different ways, not just around issues of justice, but you know, other areas too. So I just want you to know that, you know, we're at the diocese we're open to hearing from you all and are there to support however the mission in the gospel is moving through. So, okay, I mean that, and you can take my card for all the other. Thank you all.
Great, we'll do that.
Think of that as our pledge to the diocese. Unlike you all giving to St. Paul's, it's not optional, and it's set at 10%.
No,
So,
12.
so
12.
well, it's
We want 10.
St. Paul's, where 10 or 12% of that goes to the diocese. Once in a while, or maybe actually quite a lot, I hear, what is the diocese ever done? It's lobbying for government is really sharp. What's that? No, it's actually
Closer to
the iPhone.
Yeah.
So that,
Thank you.
that is,
I gotta see if I pointed at myself or close anyway.
You're good.
That is one of those examples of where our pledge is working at the diocese. And it also means we have a stake, so we can hold the diocese accountable, and we can take Ranjit's card and call it up and say, what about this? What about this? Here's what we're doing. And of course, how can we help other churches? You know, there's a lot of give and take here. And there's a lot of, so I think we're on the tip of the iceberg here of learning how to leverage our belonging to, how many parishes are in the diocese? Well, there are 152, which is big. And a lot of the smaller ones are doing some of the most creative work right now. So it's not just about being big and wealthy. The second thing I want to say is this is, as I've been saying, a foundational meeting that leads to next week, which is going to be a big attendance meeting, I'm guessing, and lots of people with lots of ideas. And that's exactly what we want. We're not going to be winnowing or editing at that meeting. We're going to be listening well. So do come. But following that meeting on the 13th, we will take all those ideas, and by we I mean you. and I'm speaking to people listening to me and online and in this space. Consider the option of joining the group that will do that work of saying, wow, we've got 400 ideas. How do we, as a parish, choose the ones that we're going to act on as a parish? We have lots more that are being acted upon as individuals. But that winnowing work is deep discernment. And we will do that, but it's going to be some of us who say, yes, I'm into that kind of work. So start praying now and thinking now whether that is something you want to be doing. We've been holding the coals for the last year or so. Myself, Gail, Marva, Sandy has just joined the anti-racism leadership group, Anthony, where we've been, this is out of this came the History Project, Sacred Ground, Juneteenth, MLK. So anything that we do from the parish as a parish will come out of that group. And we want it to be bigger and robust. So last thing, when you go home tonight, just take 5 minutes to sit and reflect back on something you heard tonight. Just let it bubble up. Say, what caught my attention? What challenged me? What intrigued me? Just notice that. And just by noticing it, it starts taking root. And that's all. Let it go. Let it start to do its work. And it will. It's that crazy way in which you said several times, Ranjit, it's like God. But that's all Jesus had too. I mean, it's just come and see, invitation, and deep listening presence, vulnerability. Nothing but open arms of love nailed to the cross. And it changes the world. Thank you for leading us in that. Thank you for doing the work you're doing. Thank you all for engaging. God give us peace and good rest tonight. See you in church. Good night.